Hello and welcome to Kai Keys, Pass the Keys. This is going to be my kind of discussion type of video. A type of video where we can sit down and have a chat about a particular subject that's doing the rounds in the automotive world at the moment. I've got some fairly big things planned for this in a few weeks. I'm going down to the NEC in Birmingham for a classic car show. So hopefully we'll get a few enthusiasts to come along, come on the show. I'm going to pass the keys over to them and they can tell me about what they're passionate about. And I'd like to pass the keys to you as well. I'd like you to tell me in the comments what you think of today's video and the subject that we're discussing. And the subject that we're discussing is, as you've seen by the title of the video, the electrification of classic cars. That's right, we're starting it out with a very, very controversial one. So what exactly is an electric classic car? Well, you've guessed it. It's a classic car which did have an internal combustion engine, which has been converted to an electric powertrain and drivetrain. And these are becoming more popular. You might remember that when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were married, they famously drove around in an electric Jaguar E-Type. And that's really where the electric classic car discussion kicked off, as far as I'm aware, and really reached the mainstream. And the BBC, back when they were reporting on the marriage, did say that the E-Type was an electric car, and they were fairly positive about the whole thing. Of course, they do have to try and remain as impartial as they can. So really, it kicked off an awful lot of discussion on electric classic cars. Some people were saying that it was a perfect blend of old and new technology, and then you had lots of people saying that it was sacrilege and that they were destroying a piece of history. Obviously, the E-Type that they converted, I'm not entirely certain which engine it had, but it may well have been the very famous and admittedly ridiculous Jaguar V12. So I can kind of understand both trains of thought with this. And personally, I'm on the fence with the whole issue. I think on some cars it's a great thing, and on other vehicles, I'm not too sure. And people typically will fall into one or two camps, so I hope to offer a little bit of balance and hopefully a little bit of nuance in this discussion. Now, personally, I'm really interested in electric cars, and I'm generally quite optimistic about them. And look, I do have massive concerns with the infrastructure and the environmental impact of electric vehicles. I don't think that the government's plans on banning sales of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035 is feasible. I mean, prove me wrong, but I don't think that we have the necessary infrastructure, certainly not currently, and I don't think that we'll be able to roll it out unless we can get that charging time to being comparable to a petrol or a diesel vehicle. People are going to want the convenience of an internal combustion engine. Essentially, unless there's big charging stations that can charge your car rapidly, an awful lot of people are not going to be able to use an electric car day to day. An awful lot of people do many, many miles and live in terraced housing where you cannot put reasonably an electric charge point outside. Whilst I was writing a few notes on today's discussion, writing a little bit of a case study, I was actually listening to the radio, and some chap popped up on Radio 4 and was talking about his electric vehicle conversion company, and he brought up an excellent point. And that's essentially that whilst there are pros and cons to electric vehicles and the environmental impact of them, which I don't really want to get too into, we need to move away from this culture of buying new things. Whilst there may be advantages to purchasing an electric car, the fact of the matter is that producing a car creates an absolutely tremendous amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. You've not only got to process the metal and smelt it and everything, but think of all of the parts that are in a car. There's thousands and thousands of them coming from loads of different factories. You've got to put them all on a truck. They've all got to get to a factory, and the vehicle's got to get built. It is a tremendous waste of resources. And what this fellow was saying is that by converting existing internal combustion engine cars, you get rid of a lot of that environmental impact because you are admittedly still producing parts, but you're producing less of them. so the environmental impact is lowered. There's a lot of arguments as well about living in a throwaway society, and that's very much true as well, and I really think that we need to step away from that. But let's not get too massively ahead of ourselves here. Let's stick to the matter at hand. I was looking on a website of an electric vehicle converter. It was the largest currently in the country. I'd love to go down there and have a look because the process does fascinate me. And I've got 2 case studies on 2 vehicles. And those vehicles are the Volkswagen Beetle, the classic Beetle, and the Ferrari Testarossa, which is another iconic vehicle. These are 2 diametrically opposed vehicles as well. The Volkswagen Beetle is famously a small city car, typically, unless it's been converted, with an air-cooled engine in the back. It was made to be simple, reliable, practical, and above all, a people's car, which admittedly it was, and it's incredibly iconic. They've made absolutely millions of them and didn't stop producing them until that long ago in the grand scheme of things. It was an incredibly long-lived vehicle. They were actually still producing the classic Beetle when they were producing the new Beetle at the turn of the century. It's supposed to be reliable, simple, and easy to maintain. And as far as I'm concerned, if you want to stick with the usage case of a classic Beetle, then an electric conversion honestly makes an awful lot of sense. You need to bear in mind that they made millions and millions of these cars, and they're not rare by any stretch of the imagination. There's probably an old Volkswagen Beetle on your street. An electric conversion will also have superior acceleration over the original model. It will most likely have a superior top speed, and bear in mind that around town it will essentially be silent. And I think that it makes an awful lot of sense. Regarding the issue with charging, that's sort of negated if you get a classic car. Most people with classic cars don't treat them as their main mode of transport. They'll typically be somebody's second or maybe even their third vehicle. And as a result, they're probably realistically going to be fairly well off and doing very few miles. So the charging argument doesn't really come into play here. It's essentially a heart over head discussion though in regards to classic cars. It always is. You're going to have a lot of very opinionated people on each side. And I can understand the argument that people have that you're destroying a piece of history. However, there's so many examples of the Volkswagen Beetle still around. As was said on Top Gear many years ago, you only really need one example of a car to survive, essentially. I know that they only wanted one Morris Marina to survive, and even then I think that's being a little bit too generous. So this brings me on to the argument regarding the Ferrari Testarossa, which is, as you know, an iconic car. It's rare. Some may even say it's a work of art, and of course it was in Miami Vice, so it's automatically very, very cool. And I wonder what Ferrari think of an electric Testarossa. Ferrari are notoriously incredibly protective of their brand. They don't like anybody really doing anything, and they will write cease and desist letters to owners of Ferraris. So who knows what Ferrari's opinion is on this. You've got to bear in mind that it's not a fast car anymore. Well, it's not slow. 0 to 60 in approximately 5 seconds is speedy, but compared to modern equivalents, it's really not fast. I'm sure that a Kia EV9 GT could probably give it a good run for its money on the straights. But it's not really about the speed of the car, really. When you're discussing classic vehicles, it's about the whole experience, and it's a multi-sensory experience, really. Owning and driving a classic car, it fulfills all 5 senses, really. You've got the sight of the vehicle itself. Some of these cars look absolutely iconic, and a classic car will objectively look different to a modern car, because of course with a modern vehicle you've got all the safety standards which kind of bloat the vehicle a fair bit. Lots of classic cars are very bare bones. You've got the touch, by which I mean the road feel of the car. How it handles a classic car is typically more lightweight, and an internal combustion engine is often, in the vast majority of cases, going to be lighter than the EV equivalent. You've also got the sound of the car. Now, this is negated with an electric vehicle. And I think that in a luxury vehicle, as I mentioned at the start of this video, like a Jaguar E-Type Grand Cruiser kind of car, you've got an electric powertrain would make sense. But in something like a supercar, the sound is really part of the experience. A sports car, a supercar, even like a two-seater roadster. You've got the smell of the thing, of course. Lots of classic cars, part of it, lots of them don't have catalytic converters, so you can smell them. You've got the smell of the petrol, you've got the smell of the oil as you're inevitably working on it, which, yeah, again, there's something to be said for the maintenance of electric cars, that they're a lot less hands-on, and that typically the average person working in their shed probably isn't going to want to or be able to work on electric vehicles. And if they do, they've got to learn an entirely new skill set. And of course, we can't neglect the taste, as you end up with a mouthful of brake dust. So really, with the Ferrari Testarossa, it's a much more passionate, opinions-driven argument, as opposed to the fact of the Volkswagen Beetle that an electric drivetrain might actually improve the usability of the vehicle. Absolutely nobody is daily driving a Ferrari Testarossa, so really the conversion is about upsetting the purists, as one potentially, and secondly, and most important really, in a car like that, it's about performance. Now, an EV Ferrari Testarossa may well be faster than the original one in a straight line. You're going to have more weight though, unfortunately, which is going to be a detriment to handling. But I think that ultimately what this argument mostly boils down to, and I don't want to make this video overly long, so I'm going to try and wrap things up, really, a car is property. You may think that it's a piece of history, and certain cars are, but ultimately somebody will own that car. And it really stems into the argument of, do you think that somebody is allowed to do exactly what they want with a car, or do you think that really we should keep them as true to stock as possible? I suppose it's a similar argument really to the arguments for and against banger racing, although admittedly, my opinion on banger racing, that'd be another excellent discussion, but my opinion on banger racing is much more conservative than many people. I'm typically kind of against it, but which, it's something for me to think about, seeing as I'm fairly pro EV swaps. It's an interesting one, but what I'd also like to pose the question to is, what do you think about typical internal combustion engine swaps, and why is an EV drivetrain swap so different? Because it's not. You're still taking the engine out. It's really, I suppose, a shipper thesis debate. Is it the same car if you change the engine? Because many people would argue that the engine is the most important part of the car. Of course, the styling, the suspension components, and the history are all important, but ultimately, the engine is the thing that makes the car go anywhere. And then working on the car, you get a lot of people saying that part of the joy of owning a classic car is working on the thing, and I agree. I don't like the frustration when something goes wrong, but when you crack that problem and you get it sorted, the sense of joy is palpable. It's brilliant, and that's why we love the industry we're in. We love working on classic cars, and we love it as a hobby, and we love it as a career. And you're not really going to get that on electric vehicles. Now, there are people who can work on electric vehicles, but let's be honest, I think that the kind of person who will pay to have money to have an EV conversion is probably in a different category to the kind of person who enjoys sitting in their shed in the weekends tinkering with their old MG. That is a generalisation, but typically I don't think there's too much overlap. And there's a very, very large section of car enthusiasts who will buy vehicles, classic vehicles, and get somebody else to do the maintenance on them. And that's perfectly fine. Working on classic cars isn't for everybody. Sometimes it can be frustrating, sometimes it can be very daunting. Some people might physically not be able to, and that's okay, as long as we love the cars, and that's all that matters, really. I found the car community to typically be quite welcoming and fairly open, and there are far more egregious things that you can do with cars, such as putting excessive camber on the things or lowering them, which I do have quite a strong opinion on, which I may get round to in another video. The fact of the matter is, I really think that ultimately it's car dependent. I can really see the appeal, and I am 100% for converting old city cars to electric. Morris Minors, Austin A35s, Volkswagen Beetles. Let's make these things effective daily drivers because they're smaller than modern city cars. They typically got more interior space, better visibility, they look better, and they just make perfect sense to use as a daily driver in this modern age. As the chap on Radio 4 was saying, let's get rid of this throwaway society. And I really think that if you've got a classic car in the garage that never goes anywhere, why not use the thing? Ultimately, cars were made to be used. It does make me sad when I see a car that's been sat in a garage all its life and is never driven, because that's really against the point of a car. And that does include multi-million pound vehicles. I remember there was a really controversial video from, I believe it was Tax the Rich on YouTube, which showed it was either an F40 or an Enzo drifting around a farm. You had lots of people saying, this is disgusting, it's a work of art that you're defacing. And there were other people saying, look, it's a car. A car should be used. And I'm firmly on the latter. So overall, EV conversions on classic cars, look, whilst I can really understand why people may not like them, and I can understand that, honestly, they get my seal of approval. I'm not a sucker for originality. I'm really not. What I like to see is cars being kept on the road. I like to see cars being used. And if you're going to get more usability and you're going to get more drivability personally from converting your internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, then you've got my seal of approval, really. And if that internal combustion engine goes to another owner to keep their car on the road, it's a win-win because you've got two cars remaining on the road. So I may well have annoyed you with this opinion of mine, or you may agree. I want to hand over the keys to you, and I want you to tell me in the comments what you think, really. I want you to tell me what you thought of this kind of discussion debate video, and I do plan in the next few weeks of having some really interesting interviews with other people, but I thought I'd put out this one-to-one chat really, so you know a little bit more about me, and hopefully I'll know a little bit more about you and your opinions in the comments. But let's just agree on one thing. If there's a car that you have to convert to electric, I want to know which one it'd be for you personally, but can we agree that in every single case possible, an electric DeLorean is the way to go? Thanks for watching this first episode of Pass the Keys. I really appreciate your support, and let me know what you think of this video format. It's something to fill in the gaps between the longer car reviews, and it's a little bit of a practice for me as well, talking to the camera, getting my kind of podcasting skills going. So I really appreciate the support. Thank you, everybody, and I'll catch you in the next one. And remember, don't forget your Kai keys.